Welcome to my talk about fairies, fakers, and factories. Uh, Let me first briefly introduce myself. My name is Jaap Coomans. I live in Tilburg in the Netherlands, and I've been doing Java for quite a while. Currently a software architect working for Group 9. And besides that, I'm working together with two other enthusiasts to found the Brabantjug. So if there's any Brabo's in the zaal, stay tuned. We'll come soon with our first event. Outside work, I'm the father of two girls. I'm an avid board game player, and while playing board games, I'd like to sample some craft beers. But that's more than enough about me. Let's talk about, well, not rocket science, sorry. So if you were expecting any rocket science, this is the time to leave the room. You're welcome. Everything I'm going to tell today is not new, not invented by me, or not really unseen before. But what I'm going to talk about, I've shared with a couple of teams I've been working with in the last couple of years. And while most people say, okay, I recognize this, I recognize that, but putting it all together, I mostly get the response, hey, that's useful, didn't know that. So I thought I could share it at a conference as well, so there we are. Say you're creating an application, a bookstore, and well, you've done some nice coding, but you think, oh, I need to write a unit test. And of course, it's a bookstore, so it involves a book. I need to create a book. Let's see, it needs an ID. Well, no one can go wrong with 42, of course. Great ID for a book. But yeah, I need to set it and later on use it in my assertion probably, and maybe I want to use it more often, so I'll put it in a constant. But the book also needs a title. Okay, well, test book title. That seems fair. And a description. Test book description. Okay. Oh, okay. Can I get to my unit test? Oh no, of course it needs an author. John Doe. It's a busy man, but he wrote the book as well. But this time I need two authors. So his sister or maybe his wife, Jane Doe, also an author. I need a publisher. Well, Acme Publishing. Sounds nice. Also a very busy company. Then the ISBN. Is that even a valid ISBN? I don't know. I'll just smash in a string. It looks like it, I'm fine. Oh, this is so tedious. We can do this better. So first of all, what we saw in the example, it's a little bit contrived, not real test data. It sorta looks like the data that you would expect, but it's not really representative for the data that would actually flow through the system. So a little example. Say you have a test for your system, and the assertion doesn't fail, but you get an exception that you didn't expect, and it says this: illegal argument exception, invalid email address test. Okay, I have a hunch where to look. There's a stack trace, so I can find a line, that's fine, but this doesn't really tell me anything. Yeah, it's not a valid email address, I can tell that. But what if I would get this? Invalid email address, Peter Johnson. Hey, that seems an awful lot to be a full name. This is probably a mix-up of fields. I immediately get a hunch what is wrong here. So, to have representative test data, that will give you better feedback on failure. And also, it helps understanding the domain. If your test data already looks like the real data in your system, then yeah, you get a better feel for what it does and what its purpose is. And it also helps in the design of the software itself, if you're thinking about how should my data look. And by doing that, you will also have to think about, okay, so what are the constraints? Think about the ISBN example. What actually is an ISBN? How long is it? What format does it have? Are there any other implications that I should take into account? So it helps you think about the design. But okay, I can do that. I can think of better examples that are more fitting and put them in the same constants. But still there's some drawbacks there. What I actually want is slightly different data every time I run my tests. Randomized test data. And I specifically say randomized, not random. So first of all, it shouldn't be completely random, because then it's no longer representative. So if I have a full name and I fill it with a completely random string, there will be numbers in there. And also, yeah, it doesn't need to be perfect random. There doesn't have to be a secure random algorithm behind it. It's test data. Come on, we don't want to stretch it. So randomized test data, that prevents test set blindness, I would call it. So if you have these constant fields that are always the same, maybe you have a little helper class somewhere, but it always outputs the same stuff. So when you write tests, that stuff is in your head. And you start thinking, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that, and you might miss a few cases. Also, when looking at unit tests, of course, you probably won't ever have collisions in your test data. If you have a different problem. But if you want to scale it up to integration tests and component tests, then there might be scenarios where you want to test a full scenario. And if you repeat the same data over and over again, you might run into collisions. I, for one, did a couple of times. And also, if you generate randomized test data, you're not going to be the smart guy that says, well, I've got some set of representative test data. It's right there in the database of production. I'm going to have a look at that, and I'll use some data from there. Well, there's a couple of issues around security and privacy. So, yeah, you don't want to go there. And then, as a side effect, this shouldn't be the goal of randomizing your test data, but as a side effect, it does uncover corner cases. And if you're as lucky as the previous audience I had, it will do in the demo, but that was pure bad luck, or good luck. And again, this also forces you to think about your data formats. Okay, if I want to generate an email address, what does it look like? Okay, we know there's an @ symbol somewhere in between, but yeah, what does the first part look like, the last part? Maybe the ISBN again, or your own custom identifier format that needs to fix somewhere. So let's talk about some tools that can help you do this. If you go look into tools on the internet to find something that can do this for you, you'll find quite a lot. They're often not very well adopted, but there's 3 that mostly ring up. So I want to discuss these 3 briefly. First one, EasyRandom. It does what it says on the tin. It's easy and it's random. It's an open source library. It has a little more than 1,200 stars on GitHub, or at least it had yesterday. So all this quite some adoption. This is not one of the high rollers, of course, but okay, for such a specific library. But the downside is it's primarily about random data. So not randomized, really random data. You'll see later on what that means. But very good plus side, it's very easy in data population. I can populate a full domain object, even if it's a complicated object with just one command. That's very useful. However, it says in the README it's in maintenance mode. There is some activity in the repositories, and it doesn't really say what maintenance mode means, but this doesn't really sound inviting to me to start using it or adopt it. So let's have a look at a code example. As you see at the top, I first create my EasyRandom object. It's an object that helps me to access the API. Then I have my own myPerson class. And I can tell EasyRandom with just one call to next object to populate that full class. And then I can get whatever out of it. So my person has a first name, an email, and a street. Now guess what? If I run this, what will come out? Okay, yeah, that's not exactly what I meant. So for these use cases, it's not really useful. You can tweak it. There's a lot of configuration that you can apply, but that's really, really cumbersome, especially if you compare it against the next two tools that will come. So my guess is that this is mostly useful to really test boundary conditions or numeric values. But for my personal use, I wouldn't choose it. So let's head on to others that I do use or would use. So the one that I do use a lot, Java Faker. It's also an open source project, close to 3,000 stars on GitHub. So, well, little more adoption. And this is actually the Java port of the Ruby Faker gem. So if there are any Ruby developers in the room, you might recognize it. I see at least one head nodding, so that's good. And it has more than 80 fakers. And what a faker is actually a test data generation class that focuses on one specific subject, like a person, or an address, or a book. But also more funny ones, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Always nice to have some characters over there visit you in your unit tests. And some more low-level ones, because these are the high-level examples, but there's also fakers that help you create test data based on a regex, or to randomly select the value of an enum, which can also be really useful. And finally, it supports more than 40 locales. Might not always be something you're looking for, but if you're a company located in Germany, it might be very useful that the names in your test data are German. Or if you're in the Netherlands, that there are Dutch names or English names. There are quite a few differences in there, and that might matter. So, similar example as we saw before, and you may see some differences, and some things are the same, like I start with creating a new Faker object. Again, that's the access to the Faker API for me. And in this example, I again have a first name, an email, and a street, and I used 3 different fakers for that. So for the first name, I use the name faker. For the email address, I use the internet faker. And for the address, the street name, I use the address faker. And you see, this is only generating separate pieces of data. It's not populating anything yet. If you use Java Faker, you'll have to populate the stuff yourself. And you can make it so that there are some inputs, like I now generate a random email address. I can already specify the first part so that it matches up with the name, for instance. But if I run this, I get values like these. That's pretty useful, right? I actually know someone named Jules. VitoPauchek@hotmail.com. I think I can send an email there that doesn't bounce. And, well, Felicia Plaza, that sounds like a lovely place to live. I'd like to visit there. So this is way more useful in its output. So next, jFairy. jFairy, again, is an open source library. It's, less stars than the other two, but you can find quite a lot of stuff about jFairy online. And I think the main reason for that, it's been around longer and has maybe more adoption, but not as many stars. It's created by a company called devskiller.com, and I'm fairly certain, it doesn't say anywhere, that they created it for their own use, and then made an open source project out of it, which is great in my opinion. And the good thing, interesting here, it's targeted at profiles, so profiles of a person. So in my previous example, you saw I have to generate all the fields separately, with jFairy, you can generate all the data at once, or a lot of data at once, which means it's all related. So we see later on that the name will match the email address. So you can generate a lot of stuff, company details, person details, address details, bank account details, that all match up. There are some basic tools still in jFairy as well to do things like generating real random values, but less than in javaFaker. And finally, it supports 8 locales. Slightly less, but I don't know them by heart, but I believe it's English, Chinese, German, French. So quite common ones that are useful. Again, this example looks familiar by now, I think. You create a new Fairy object, and from there you can start generating data. And in this case, I call fairy.person, which gives me a person object from the jFairy API. So not my own person class, but a jFairy person. And I can then query that person. It's a fully populated object with, for instance, again, first name, email, and street. And when I get then, it's something like this. So Alexandra, well, I actually know more than one. Alexandra Frost, that's not the one I know, but she has an email address at Yahoo that sounds real, looks real. And again, summer place, it's probably close to the other one that we had before, because it also sounds a really cool place to be. And yeah, this is real data again, and it's all related to each other, which is very useful. Yeah, this is quite a nice thing. They have a website, jFairy. You can go there, and it uses this library underneath, and you can just click next profile, next profile, next profile, and it'll get a lot of people, companies that are completely random, but it's fun to play with. Then I also dove a little bit into how much is this used. It's a little bit of niche, so it's hard to find real good numbers, but yeah, I already looked at the actual current number of stars, but there's also this useful website that allows you to draw a graph over the stars over time, and that also tells you something pretty interesting, I think. See the yellow line, that's jFairy. And you can see it's been around the longest, but right now, with the stars at least, it's a little bit flattening. Then EasyRandom is ramping up steadily. But javaFaker is really lifting off. So looking towards the future, if you say, okay, I want to adopt one of these tools, while jFairy has some very useful things in their API, I would bet on javaFaker. But it's very personal, of course, and also dependent on what your company allows or wants you to do. Now, we've got some tools. And again, I could smash all the results into my list of constants, and that would improve things a lot, but still, yeah, it's not really, really useful. So what I usually do is I create test data factories. It's not really a well-known term, it's just something I call them myself, but yeah, again, this does what it says on the tin. It's a factory that creates test data. I know Martin Fowler has written a piece about model objects. It's pretty close to this, except that doesn't produce randomized data. So I tried to devise a definition. Let's look at a couple of pieces of that. So first of all, they're static factories. That's simple. Just factory methods in factory classes that we maybe have in our production code as well. And it provides generated test data. So every time I call it, I get different test data. And randomized, of course. We discussed that. It must be randomized. And what I primarily do with this is the goal of the factory is to put out a fully populated domain object. Because if I start at my domain with my test data and I center it around my domain, I can go anywhere. I can go in the persistence layer and map stuff there. I can use it in my REST layer. I do that by providing smaller factory methods that provide pieces of the puzzle. And then, as you will see later on, we'll look at some examples. I put it together and let it expose fully populated domain objects. So here's an example of a test of the bookstore that we saw before, how it would look like if you would have a test data factory, the book factory in this case. So it's a simple test where I test the order method of my bookstore. And to order a book, I need a book. And for that reason, this method is called exactly that, a book. I don't care what book. I don't care about the title. I don't care about the author, the publisher, the ISBN. I don't care. All I care about is that it's a valid book and I want to use it in my test. And then if you do static imports, you get things like this. And I think that's pretty readable, right? I have a book and it's just a book. Now, a little more complicated example. Say, in my bookstore, I want to be able to deliver books, but only orders that have been paid can be delivered, and I want to test that. So what I actually want to test, that I cannot deliver orders that don't have status paid. So I have a parameterized test, and this time my method is called an order. I don't care what order. It can be for a car, for a book, for whatever, 10 books. All I care about is the status, so I add a parameter there to put in the status. And this way I can very easily test all non-paid statuses and still have my test data in order. Okay, that's enough slides so far. I've got some real code in an IDE. Let's see if that fires up. Yeah, it's up, right. So let's have a look here at some factories. This is a different example. It's not the full application. I have this on GitHub, so you can have a look on it later at your own term if you want to. It's the domain part of a call for papers application, where as a speaker you can send in a paper for a conference and it can be selected. I have no clue where I got that ID, but it seemed like something I understand. And I have a few factories implemented there in the test already. Like, let's see, the paper test data factory. And, well, this is my personal approach. I wouldn't say this is universally good for everyone, but what I mostly do is I work my way down the domain object. So I start at the top with helper methods, and in this case, that just generate a paper ID. I don't care about what paper ID. I have an alternative one, because the paper ID apparently includes a conference ID that allows me to feed it the conference ID, so I can relate what I'm creating to what I already had. Then, of course, I also have a method here to generate a conference ID. This is actually kind of lost. It should be in the conference test data factory, but I didn't create that. Sorry for that. And then here, there's a title. Here you see I'm using Java Faker for this example, by the way. You can do a lot using Java Faker or any of the other tools, but sometimes you have to fiddle around yourselves. And this time I thought, well, okay, I have the options faker, which allows me to select a random piece of information. So let's use that twice, one for the subject and one for a title pattern where I fit it in to make it look like a real title. There's different ways to achieve this, of course, but yeah, I thought that was nice. Okay, what you mostly I also need is an outline. What will my talk look like? That's something that the program committee will look at. I personally divide that in parts, so I try to produce that a little bit here with a pattern as well. And here I use the lorem faker, produces lorem ipsum. I can ask it to produce words, sentences, paragraphs, a lot of lorem. Here, the abstract, I thought, well, 15 paragraphs will do, right? Message to the programming committee. Ooh, this doesn't fit on the screen. Also some lorem. Oh yeah, and I generate more paragraphs and add some new lines in between there. Then a status, which I apparently don't use currently. A session type, so is it a full conference session? Is it a quickie? Is it bite size? And then I have two methods that pull it all together that I use in my tests. So first of all, a valid paper. If I want to test something about my paper, and I don't really care what kind of paper it is, just that it is a valid paper, and I add in a status here. And there's another one, also a valid paper, that also allows me to set the speaker ID. And that's useful if I want to have bigger examples where I have a speaker that's related to the paper. Good, then let's have a quick look at the speaker test data factory. Well, you see a similar pattern. I start from the top and work my way down there. And here I actually have two methods. An empty speaker, because if you want to sign up, you start with just your email address, and later on you get your time to, at your own pace, fill in your bio and stuff. And a valid speaker that's fully populated. Now, I can show a lot of things, but what I thought was quite nice. Well, technically this is a unit test, but it's not. It's just a demo. To abuse JUnit to run my demo. And what it does, it will create a speaker and a paper that belongs to that speaker, and it will print it out so that you get a little bit of an idea what will roll out of this if you use it. So let's see what we get. Well, Tish Olsen the third. Wow, that's some cool name. And 11 ways to improve your test with AWS Infinidash. That's a nice use of Infinidash, right? Conference talk, okay, right. So there's an abstract there with a lot of lorem in it. There's some message to the program committee, also seem to be persuaded by lorem, and a little outline. Also again lorem, but then structured according to my template. And yeah, well, I can run that again. Let's see what it puts out then. Yes, excellent. I was hoping for this. I ran this test over and over and over and over again at home. And a few days ago, I did this talk at another conference, and I got exactly this error. So this just proves it also uncovers some cases that you didn't account for. In this case, there's a quote in the name, and I used the name to create a valid Twitter handle, and a valid Twitter handle cannot include a quote, so I didn't cover for that case. So that's actually accidental demo. Okay, there's Jamison Coolidge Jr. Also Infinidash from the trenches. It's been working with Infinidash for a while, I guess, but it's a quickie, so it might be off quick. Oh, you get the gist. I can play with this all day. It's just fun to do. But let's not. Let's see. Whoa, I'm good with the time. So, to recap a little bit about test data factories. In my experience, and this is also what I get back from people who I introduce to this. It feels more productive. You might now say, okay, but I saw a lot of code to generate test data, and that's quite a lot of work. That's right, but that's mostly one-time work. You do that the first time you start building this up for a test. And if you work your way towards your domain object at the end, you've got everything that relates to that domain object covered. And from then on, in any test, new use case comes in about a book. I've got a book here, I can generate it. A book, an author, a car, a bill, anything you want. If you have it in your domain already, it's there at your fingertips. And that helps you to focus on the test itself. You're not distracted by the fact that you have to come up with some test data. It's there already. And eventually, personally at least, I think it gives you more readable tests. If at the top of your test it says, well, here's a book and it's a book, that's more readable than new book, set title, set author, and all kinds of constants being referenced. Of course, you put that in a nice little helper method if you do that, but you get the point. So to wrap up, good test data is representative. It helps you to see how the system is used in production. If you have test data that's representative for your actual data, you get a feel for the system. But it should be randomized. Not completely random as we saw. That's also not what you want. But if you run with slightly different test data every time, you don't get hung up on that single test set that you have. And you might uncover more test cases. There's some good tools that will help you. There's also some stuff that you still need to do yourself. And that doing it yourself, you can do that by using test data factories. They provide structure to your code, to your test data code. And with that, we've reached the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention. Please help me improve, so fill out the app with feedback or come up to me or contact me via Twitter. And if you're really interested and want to see more about the example, I have it on GitHub. The QR code is the GitHub repository, so scan that if you're into that. So, thanks. I think there's time for questions if anyone wants. Yes. That's a very good question. Yeah. So the question is actually, if you use Mockito, like the questioner does, and I do a lot, do you still use mocks, or do you use your fully populated domain object from your factories? And I have to say, I personally, for these domain objects, I personally almost never use mocks anymore. This really helps me to get rid of the mocks and also the kind of unreliability they tend to have in these situations. So still for external services, etc., I mock my way around to isolate my test. But if I'm down to the level where I'm letting data flow through my system, then I mostly use this. I rarely use mocks. And also, I'm currently in a project that was already there when I joined. We're slowly doing a couple of these things, but there's a lot of mocks in there for exactly this situation, because it was so difficult to create the things. Yeah, at the point where now, it's really difficult to assemble a complete domain object. But if we would have started from the get-go, then it would be simple, because you have the smaller building blocks to add on over time. Yeah, in the back. That's a good question. So the question actually is, you in Ruby and Python, you said. I'm not really good with either of them, so I can't reflect on that. You can have specializations. For instance, I had a book and then I had a separate book for a book with title, and apparently there you can easily do that. What's my experience with that in Java? Well, I haven't figured out really a better way yet to do this. I have to admit, in some cases, I think, okay, this is going to be a lot of different methods doing roughly the same, but mostly there's fairly little variance in what you want. Mostly it's just one thing that you care about. And you must have a complete object that's full and fully populated and valid, but mostly it's just one thing that you really care about in your test, like the status or something. So, yeah, if you have any ideas, please throw them at me. I'd love to learn. Yeah.
Maybe you could use the builder method to create a class, and then create, that's what we do. We create a generator, which does the random data, and it extends the builder.
Ah, that's interesting.
And then you can say, generate a class with a specific status, for instance, or
Yeah.
specific type.
So you have kind of a builder pattern fluent API, you say, for creating test data.
Yeah.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, that's a nice approach. You could do that. I'm going to try that out, actually. So if you create some kind of builder that does this instead of your factory, well, you can start with a thing and then have your, like a book, and then with title, for instance, on top of that, to get a book with that title. That's an interesting suggestion. Huh.
Then you don't have to override all the constructors with or static constructors and to implement all your situations, because that's already in the pattern,
No.
in the builder.
Oh. Okay, thanks. Good suggestion. All the way in the back.
How do you go about testing for failure?
Testing for failure. Yeah, I didn't show it a lot in my demo, but that's a good question. Mostly besides a valid thing, I also have an invalid thing. Like, but there's a mixture of these. So in some cases where I say, okay, I want a book with this specific title, I can say I want a book with this specific invalid title. And there it becomes a little harder to generate it. Yeah, you really have to think of an invalid title. It's not that these tools say, okay, I've got some invalid names here for you. That's and in some cases, I actually have complete methods that create an invalid object, just to test for failure, indeed. Yeah. Yes.
I like my unit tests to be consistent in the results, but is there a good way to combine that with getting randomized test data and still get consistent results, so you don't run it like 3 times locally and it goes fine?
Yeah.
You push it and then it fails?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so the question is, I want my tests to be actually reproducible. So I don't get any surprises when I run them over and over again, especially not when I just push my code and I get an error in the pipeline while it works locally. How do you combine this? Oh, well, there's always a little risk that you run into that, but that's also why I said you're forced to think about your constraints properly. You saw it in the demo, and I'm very glad it popped up, because I was about to do a little prep to force this via a roundabout way, but I didn't have time, so glad that it popped up. You can always run into that. So you have to be careful that when you generate random data, that you properly think, okay, what are actually the constraints? You may have seen it when I glossed over the factories, that, for instance, the lorem faker allows you to specify the amount of words, the amount of sentences, the amount of paragraphs, but not the amount of characters. So what I needed to do is chop it off at 500 characters, because that's the limit I had for a certain field. And also the other way around, if I then want an invalid value, I repeat the process to get enough lorem to go over 500 characters. So yeah, you have to guard that yourself.
Is it easy to add fakers or add, I mean, if you had a Twitter handle faker?
That's something I didn't look into yet, to add your own fakers. I think it's not really set up for that because everything goes via the faker object. So yeah, well, you can add it, file a PR, and then you have your. That's the best way. It's not really designed for extension right now. Oh, yeah.
Is there some uniqueness in the data? Suppose I want to add 1 million users with a unique email address. More like
I don't know the exact numbers. I've been looking a little bit in the source code that goes beneath, at least for Java Faker. I can't speak for jFairy. Mostly it's a list of values that it reads from a file that is in the jar, and it combines. So there's not a hard guarantee that you won't get duplicates or something like that. So if indeed you want to use this to generate larger sets of test data, I'm not sure where the boundaries where it breaks.
And there's also no guarantee that you have unique value.
No, there's no guarantee. No. Yeah, definitely.
Suppose you run into a situation where randomized data fails your test. How can you reproduce the exact situation?
Yeah. How can you reproduce the exact situation if your test fails over your randomized data? Yeah, well, yeah. The answer is you can't, but you've got some proper output, or at least if you have your assertions libraries right, you get output of what it fails over, and then you see what data was there. So what you then can do, okay, I just do that manually, put that type of data in, go over the debugger, see where it fails if I can't figure it out from the output of my test yet.
So there's no printing of seeds for a random generator or something, so you can maybe pop that in and reproduce.
Not to my knowledge, but I might just not have looked at that because it didn't cross my mind yet.
You serialize the object so the next run you can deserialize again. Is that not same? Does it support it?
There's no support to serialize your object, so you can deserialize them later, but nothing stops you from doing that yourself. Okay, then let's have some lunch.